My name is Eva Näripea. I'm the director of Estonian Film Archive, and I am absolutely delighted that the retrospective program of the 2020 edition of the Nordic Film Days again features some interesting examples from Estonian film history. Many commentators regard Men from the Fisherman's Village, the film you're about to see, as the first truly Estonian production of the Soviet years. It was the diploma film of at the All-Union State Institute of Cinematography in Moscow for its director Jüri Müür, as well as for the cinematographers Jüri Karsnek and Harri Rehe, and the production designer Linda Vernik. These young Estonian filmmakers represented a new generation that consisted to a great extent of ethnic Estonians and local talent, as opposed to the so-called visiting filmmakers who had dominated the sphere of Soviet Estonian film in the immediate post-war era, that is until the end of the 1950s. Tatjana Elmanovich, an Estonian film critic, has written that Men from the Fisherman's Village carried a special mission. She says that at last our own cinema was made, scripted by our own writers, directed and cinematographed by our own filmmakers. Although Men from the Fisherman's Village contains several emblematic codes of the socialist realist canon, perhaps most importantly the typically unsuccessful attempt of a Western spy to harm the Soviet system and people, the filmmaker's approach to the story reveals a marked break from the previous discourse. Above all, as is typical of post-Stalinist narratives in general, even though the fishermen constitute a collective working-class protagonist, the Stalinist myth of the great family of the Soviet people is here decisively atomized into a set of smaller families and individual relationships. The group of fishermen consists of characters whose ideals and problems, pasts and goals are indeed quite distinctly diverse. Moreover, the filmmakers clearly avoid clear-cut black and white characterizations and judgments. Most notably, this is manifested in the portrayal of Kandel, the emigrant spy. While he is identified as an enemy, his potential dangerousness is actually neutralized by his rather mousy appearance and helplessly propagandistic utterances. This becomes especially obvious in the absence of straightforward Soviet propaganda in the dialogues in general. Men from the Fisherman's Village demonstrates a significant change towards greater localness, towards distinct national concerns brought about by the new generation of native filmmakers. And yet this film is also clearly a witness to the conditions and processes that originated far outside the borders of national community. In their alma mater in Moscow, the young filmmakers had been put into contact with Western cinema's history and its newest trends. In particular, Italian neorealism was a major influence, signaled in Müür's film, for example, by the lack of conventional plot structure and the replacement of false classicist and airbrushed socialist realism with observation of life, genuine environments, and casual improvisations. This tendency of de-heroization has found its way to the Soviet cinema, or had found its way to the Soviet cinema to a great extent precisely through the neo-realist films, and had formed the basis of such famous works as Kalatozov's The Cranes Are Flying and Chukrai's Ballad of a Soldier, both of which were widely acclaimed by the Estonian press and audiences. The nationality, so to say, of men from the fisherman's village most significantly manifests in the film's emphasis on a particular environment and characters of that environment. Ivar Kosenkranius, an Estonian film critic, summarized the essence of the film as follows. The men from the fisherman's village implicitly connote homeland and nation. In other words, the identity of the characters is defined less by their social class or ideological inclinations than by their sense of belonging to a specific place that is regarded in an inalienable domain of their linguistic and cultural community, the land and the nation being one and the same. As opposed to the films of the 1940s and 1950s, Men from the Fisherman's Village reconnects people and their everyday lives with their surroundings, demonstrating that regardless of changes in ideological regime, the people inhabiting the seaboard maintain their customary sources of substance and patterns of existence, which rely to a great extent upon the seasonal rhythms as well as upon the profound respect for the elements. Here, nature is not merely a passive horizon, a simple backdrop. Rather, it functions as an important trigger of events, an active narrative agent. I hope you will enjoy the film. Thank you. Hello, my name is Eva Näripea. I'm the director of Estonian Film Archive, and I'm very glad that this edition of the Nordic Film Days again features some interesting examples from Estonian film heritage. The film you're about to see, Rocks on the Water, directed by Viktor Neveshin and produced by Tallinn Film, the state film studio of the Estonian SSR in 1959, belongs to a rather particular period of Estonian film history, one that was preceded by the immediate post-war Stalinist years of rather stiff socialist realist aesthetics and unambiguous ideological inclinations, which was introduced by the Soviet cinematic troops that were sent to the newly established Socialist Republic of Estonia to jumpstart the local film industry. Neveshin was a perfect example of those troops. He was born in St. Petersburg in 1906, then trained at the All-Union State of Cinematography in Moscow in the 1930s, after which he worked as an assistant director at several studios around the Soviet Union before relocating to Tallinn in 1954. The local film critics often saw these so-called visiting filmmakers as infamous unemployed of the so-called Soviet film famine of the 1950s. Artists with arguably low creative potential who raided the new national studios because they could not find work in larger central studios, and who were typically rather oblivious to the local traditions, culture, and language. The works of these directors were often characterized by the tourist gaze, to use a term coined by British sociologist John Ury, a perception of space detached from real experiential circumstances of existence. In this regard, it is important to notice how Rocks on the Water represents nature, or to be more precise, landscape, which becomes an object of repressive, objectifying subjugation. Note, for example, how the storm is overcome without too much effort by the experienced fisherman, by the fact that its primary function is to signify the inner struggles of the protagonist going astray. These pictures of people who are importantly identified as model Soviet citizens, triumphing over or taming the implicitly Estonian wilderness, could not be more eloquent in suggesting the newly established cultural hierarchies and power relations. Another aspect of the tourist gaze and the decisive rupture it creates between everyday practices and the representations of space is the process of so-called museumization. Edward Ralph, a Canadian scholar who is widely known for his studies on the phenomenological and experiential foundations of geography, uses this concept to refer to the detachment of various objects from their actual and/or traditional daily functions, turning them thus into a lifeless, exotic exhibition. In Rocks on the Water, this becomes most obvious in the case of ethnographic, or rather pseudo-ethnographic paraphernalia, such as folk customs, old knitting patterns, and traditional beer mugs, which are invested with the infamous concept of national form socialist content. Emptied of their previous political and social connotations, and filled with meanings that corresponded to the Soviet national politics, these exotic ethnographic items started to signify, in the film, the successes of the small Estonian nation in the great family of Soviet peoples. However, what differentiates Rocks on the Water from the Estonian feature films of the late 40s and early to mid 50s is its mode of audiovisual expression. While the properly Stalinist films had subscribed to a line of realism that was based mainly on the principles of continuity editing and other cinematic devices aimed at narrative clarity and what has been dubbed the so-called effect of realism, and shaped to a considerable extent to suit Stalin's personal, extremely unadventurous tastes. The film noir-like cinematography of Rocks on the Water takes cautious steps towards some formal variation, characterized by the use of sharper camera angles, more expressive viewpoints, and low-key lighting, as well as by a larger number of close-ups and even by some attempts to break up the strict narrative linearity. The film indeed amplifies the scale of cinematic devices available to Soviet cinematographers. For instance, in the last sequence where the subjective camera work simulates the drunken gait of the protagonist. These pictorial shifts are complemented by disruptions of the temporal axis, as Rocks on the Water includes both visual and sound flashbacks that would have been virtually unthinkable before 1953, when Stalin died. Finally, the trope of the border with the capitalist West that no longer seems to hold that tightly any longer, allowing the seductive ooze of subversive Western influences penetrate The Iron Curtain, anticipates the dawn of a completely new era, one that was to be shaped by a new generation of filmmakers in the 1960s. I hope you will enjoy the film.